Writers of the Harlem Renaissance by John Hanson. In the 1920s, the neighborhood of Harlem in New York City brimmed with excitement, energy, and new ideas. You could hear it in the music, in innovative jazz and soulful blues. You could hear it in the conversations, in talk about a new culture, a new kind of freedom. And you could hear it in the writing, in words that captured the spirit of changing times. Black people from the U.S. and all over the world, including the Caribbean, formed a vibrant community in Harlem around this time. The 1920s were the early years of the Great Migration, when millions of Black people left the South for a better life in the other parts of the country. Harlem quickly boomed with Black artists of all kinds, especially writers. This groundbreaking culture movement, which was centered in, but not limited to, Harlem, later became known as Harlem Renaissance. Two of the most famous writers of the movement were Langston Hughes and Georgia Douglas Johnson. Both explored some common themes in their writing about the experiences of Black Americans, such as freedom, community, racial equality, and dreams of a better life. But the two writers had very different lives and writing styles. Langston Hughes was adventurous in his life and his writing. His literary experiments would help make him one of the greatest American writers of all time. One of Hughes's most famous poems is Harlem, which tells how the American dream was unreachable for most Black people because of discrimination. Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri in 1902. When he was in high school, a teacher introduced him to the works of two great American poets, Walt Whitman and Carl Sandburg. Hughes was so moved by their works that he started writing poems himself. Hughes first moved to Harlem in 1921 as a student at Columbia University. In subsequent years, oh my goodness, my apologies. In subsequent years, his travels took him around the world, but he kept going back to Harlem. In 1926, he published his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues. In the years that followed, Hughes wrote plays, a novel, short stories, and popular newspaper columns, as well as poetry. From the start, Hughes broke with the rules of traditional poetry. He often wrote using the informal, everyday speech he heard in Black communities like Harlem, and drawing on the jazz and blues music he loved. He created surprising new rhythms in his poems. Unlike Hughes, Georgia Douglas Johnson favored formal language and structured rhythm and rhyme in her poetry. But she captured the new ideas of the time period by writing about such themes as equality and the roles of women. Her powerful poems made her one of the most widely read poets of the Harlem Renaissance. As a young mother, Johnson always wrote no matter how busy her life might be. She published her first poems in 1916 and her first book just 2 years later. After her husband died in 1925, Johnson suddenly found herself a single parent with 2 sons to support. She found work and kept writing. In addition to poems, she wrote one-act plays, songs, and a popular column that was published in many Black newspapers. Johnson didn't live in Harlem, but Harlem came to her. Her home in Washington, D.C. became famous as a meeting place for Harlem Renaissance writers. The Saturday night gatherings became known as the S Street Salon, after the street Johnson lived on. people met to discuss new ideas. They also talked about issues like racism and what it's meant to be black in America. The most famous writers of the time, including Langston Hughes, often presented new works at these events, but they were also a place to socialize, make friends, and have fun. Thanks to gifted writers like Hughes and Johnson, the Harlem Renaissance was the most important movement in the history of African American literature. The writing that came out of this time challenged racist stereotypes, pushed for social change, and transformed the way people of other races understood the Black experience. The writings of both authors are still relevant today for their powerful message of equality.